So I was just thinking about a story that I've been wanting to share with somebody, anybody really. And I thought to myself, why don't I just make a video about it? That'll be good enough. That way I can get it out of my system and share it with the world. Okay, it's not really that complicated, but a long time ago I lived up in Toronto and I worked up there and did a lot of volunteer work. Anyway, to make a long story short, I started listening to Rush music officially back in the mid 90s. And I kind of got into Rush. And I was getting their CDs through Columbia House. And one day I noticed on the back of the CD they have an address. And it's also on the back of the old albums from the 70s and 80s. The address is 189 Carlton Street East in Toronto. And I realized, even though it wasn't something until I realized much later that they were right there, and I had been walking by that address a lot when I lived in Toronto, because I had moved right across the street and just a little further up near Parliament. At 234 Carlton. That's where I was living, at 234 Carlton Street East, right near Parliament. And they were just down on the other side. And then there was another house that was associated with where I was living, just the block down on the next street down, going south. So where I was living, they changed the name to St. Michael's Halfway Homes for Men, recovering alcoholic men, older men. At the time when I was working there and living there, it was called Matt Talbot House, and it was a house or homes for recovering alcoholics and men over 50. And at the time, I was like 25 when I got hired after living in a religious order for about 4 months in the West End, down by the Polish area and Ronsonsville area on Triller Avenue. I was with the Capuchins, Order of Friar Minors, for about 4 months on that first occasion. And then a couple years later, I rejoined for another 5 months to take part in the postulancy program. But in both occasions, it wasn't exactly what I was looking for, so I had to find something else to do with my life. But anyway, after the first time that I was with the Capuchins, I got a job through them because some of the guys had worked at the houses as cooks. I went over there for a job interview and I was hired for 6 months because their cook was having a back operation and needed to take 6 months off. So I was hired as a cook. I had enough experience working in restaurants and whatnot that I could relatively easily cook for about 24 people. And I had to plan out a menu every week, and we went shopping with the guy who ran the house, and some of the guys that were living at the house would go down to help out with the groceries and whatnot, and then we would bring them back to the house, and we had a van to do that. So it was a good experience, and for 17 months I lived at one of the houses because they had an extra room that they rented me. So I would, out of my salary that I was making as a cook there, I would pay my rent, and I would live at the one house and work at the other one that was just a block away. And that included like room and board. So they had one cook at the other house where I was living named Ted, and he was a pretty good cook, and he would cook supper there, and I would cook supper down at the other place temporarily while the full-time cook was out on leave to take care of a back operation. And when he come back, I was kind of glad because it's not something I would have wanted to do indefinitely, because cooking is a very strenuous, stressful job. I don't mind cooking because I do it for myself all the time, but I've never really liked cooking as an occupation because it's a pretty stressful job. So anyway, the odd thing was that later, as I was getting into listening to Rush CDs back in the mid 90s, and this was like a few years after I had moved back to Nova Scotia from Toronto. I noticed as I was reading the cover of the CD on the back that that was the address, 189 Carleton Street, and I had been living at 234 Carleton Street East. And when I did move back to Ontario again back in 99, because in around 89, 99, I was living in Yarmouth for a year. And I once, just out of curiosity, I wrote to the address on the back of the Rush CD, 189 Carleton Street. I wrote and asked them if they had any fan fan clubs here in Canada, and they wrote me back, and they said no, they had the fan club was in Las Vegas, and I thought, oh, I thought that was too bad because I wanted to join the fan club if there was a fan club here in Canada. But the funny thing is, the person who wrote back to me signed the letter with a simple G. G as in Geddy Lee. No word of a lie. So Geddy Lee himself actually wrote me back. And that's the only time I ever wrote those guys. And I thought that was an interesting story that I would share. So, and again, when I did again move back to Ontario back in 99, and I was living in Hamilton, and in 2005, it took me a little while, but I managed to get into working up there in various capacities, doing temp work out of 3 different temp agencies. And then I did a lot of like studying on my own, like taking acting classes and whatnot. But I was able to get into doing some background work as a background actor. That's how I got into the industry. And after a few years of doing that, I managed to find an agent. But the funny thing, and he was in Toronto, the funny thing is that one day he took me to the breakdown service that he submitted some of his breakdowns to. And the address was right next to 189 Carleton Street, where the office was. And then that's when I kind of first realized that, oh my God, I was just living across the street. And I couldn't tell my agent that because we were kind of wrapped up in what he was doing. And I was following him into the breakdown service building, which was right next door. And he was introducing me to the guys that were in there. But I said to my agent, wow, I said, this is where Rush is, you know? I didn't explain who Rush was or anything like that, but there was a plaque on the house or the building, and it, it had the plaque there. It had, it had all the, the details that you would want to read to know that this is where I guess maybe it was their office or whatever. I don't know if there was any of the guys were actually living there. I think it might have been their office, or because it was, they probably lived someplace else, and that's where they did all their professional work out of an office, probably there, because that's would explain why it was just on the back of the album or the CD. So anyway, I thought that was an interesting story about Rush and how I got into becoming a Rush fan, and the fact that I was living literally across the street and these guys were actually my neighbors. And when I was in high school, I had a guy that I was in high school with who was a Rush fan, and he would always be listening to Rush on his Walkman all the time. And that was kind of like my first introduction to Rush, was this guy in high school. He